It was just past midnight on August 4th, 1992, when Susan Grund called 911 from her home in Peru, Indiana. She told the dispatcher she had found her husband, James Grund, unresponsive in the living room. Her voice trembled, a thin, wavering line of fear, yet her words came cleanly, each detail delivered without the stumbling chaos most people show in the first seconds of a crisis. The mix was unusual enough to make note of. Trembling emotion paired with uncommon composure. James "Jimmy" Grund, 47, wasn't just her husband. He was Miami County's former prosecutor, a familiar figure in this town of 13,000 tucked an hour north of Indianapolis. As word traveled through early morning phone calls and police radio traffic, officers and attorneys who knew him jolted awake. A man like Jimmy didn't simply collapse without the town feeling it. Police arrived minutes later and found James on the living room sofa, a single gunshot wound to the head. He still held a crumpled tissue in his hand as if frozen mid-gesture. Papers lay scattered around him, the television remote resting nearby, the quiet remains of an ordinary evening brought to an abrupt stop. The rest of the house told a different story. A jewelry cabinet had been opened, items swept out in a way that looked hurried but not truly searched. Drawers were disturbed without the reckless disorder typical of a real burglary. Officers would later describe it as too tidy to be desperate, more staged than stolen from. And James himself looked as though he'd been at ease when it happened. His posture hadn't tensed, his body hadn't shifted into defense. People don't hold themselves like that when a stranger enters the room. Whatever occurred in that living room, it didn't begin with fear. Susan's story began in Peru's rough edges, born in 1958 as the youngest of 7 children. Her father, William, was a steel worker whose physical aggression came with the bottle, stealing parts of childhood she could never recover. Her mother, Nellie, worked the farm, trying to hold everything together with tired hands. Children who survive aggression build walls. Sometimes those walls become new identities. Susan started calling herself by her middle name instead of Sue Ann, the individual everyone knew from modest circumstances. She learned that confidence could be armor. If you act like you belong somewhere better, eventually you will. By her teens, Susan had discovered something powerful. Her body was currency. While other girls her age wrote about first kisses, Susan collected boys like baseball cards. Some called her promiscuous Sue Ann. The nickname stung, but being notorious was better than being invisible. At 17, she packed her belongings and left for Kokomo, 20 miles away, but a whole different world. There she met Ronnie Lovell, a musician with big dreams and empty pockets. They married in 1975 after knowing each other for weeks. But sleeping in vans and living on bar tips wasn't the escape she'd imagined. So they moved to Oklahoma City, where Ronnie had roots. Susan kept running, but running from yourself means you always catch up. Susan collected marriages like stamps, quickly, carelessly, always looking for the next one before the ink dried. Wedding vows were easy. Keeping them felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. She had a hunger that never felt full. That like being thirsty no matter how much water you drink. Growing up in chaos teaches some people to crave stability. It taught Susan to crave more chaos because at least that felt familiar. While Ronnie worked construction and played gigs in Oklahoma City, Susan managed their apartment complex. Gary Campbell, a 24-year-old truck driver living across the parking lot, became her next target. When Ronnie discovered the affair, Susan didn't apologize. She simply walked across the asphalt into Gary's apartment like crossing a bridge she'd already decided to burn. Pregnant with Gary's baby, she divorced Ronnie and married Gary in 1979. She was 19 with 2 marriages behind her. Their son Jacob arrived, but babies don't fix broken things. Twice a year, Susan drove 800 miles back to Peru with baby Jacob. She'd play the perfect mother until they arrived, then drop Jacob with relatives and slip off her wedding ring like it burned her finger. Old friends watched her show up with different men each visit, sometimes disappearing to parking lots when the need hit her like a fever. It wasn't just desire, it was compulsion. Back in Oklahoma, Gary, the new husband, was learning what Ronnie had discovered. Susan wasn't just unfaithful. She was also violent. She once speared him with scissors one night. She also ran a knife through his leg another time, but after the aggression, she'd want sex. Like the anger lit a match inside her. Rage and desire were two sides of the same burning coin. After 2 years of escalating attacks, Gary had enough, but Susan was already shopping for her next life. She found it in Tom White, a co-worker at the factory where she'd gotten a job. Tom was different. College degree, former Army captain, owned his own house. He'd lost his wife to cancer and was raising his son, Tommy, alone. Susan had always picked men who lived in the same shadows she did. But Tom was clean daylight, stable, educated, respectable. This wasn't just another affair. This was Susan's chance to finally become the person she'd been pretending to be. Tom's life had been torn apart. A car crash in 1981 had forced him to give up his Army commission, while his wife Cheryl was dying of leukemia. She lost her battle right after his accident. He was stumbling through life, trying to raise Tommy alone, when Susan walked into his world. Lester Soonram, Tom's father-in-law, watched this unfold with the sharp eyes of someone who'd already lost too much. He saw how Susan looked at Tom, like a cat eyeing a bird with a broken wing. He noticed she wore a wedding ring but acted like she'd forgotten which finger it belonged on. Susan divorced Gary Campbell quickly as signing a check took custody of Jacob, and by 1982 became Susan White, her third last name by age 24. She moved into Tom's nice house near Lake Hefner, suddenly playing mother to 2 3-year-old boys, her son Jacob and Tom's son Tommy. She dressed them in matching outfits like dolls, calling them the twins, as if matching shirts could erase the fact that one boy was hers by blood and the other was just in her way. From outside, they looked like a Christmas card family. Inside, they were a horror story waiting to be written. The masks slipped just months after the wedding. Tommy White had arrived at the hospital with severe trauma to his head, his brain swelling against damaged bone. Susan's tears came fast and perfect, the kind of crying that looks real if you've never seen genuine grief. She said Tommy fell, just a terrible accident. But when a nurse asked Tommy what happened, his words came out small but clear. My mommy hit me. In 1983, Oklahoma City, people preferred to believe mothers were saints and families were private kingdoms. The hospital had Tommy's words, had Susan's shaky story, had all the pieces to see the truth. They sent him home anyway, like returning a broken toy to the person who broke it. Tommy became a ghost of himself, jumping at shadows, crying over spilled juice like it was bodily fluid. He told a friend that Susan had dropped me on my head, the closest his vocabulary could come to explaining what she'd done. May 1983. Tommy was back in the hospital, this time with bleeding inside his skull. Susan had a whole story ready. Shopping cart accidents, dog tripping incidents, concrete meetings with small heads. Each detail too perfect, too rehearsed. But bodies tell stories that words try to hide. Doctors found a map of observable physical harm across Tommy's skin. Some marks appeared to be deliberate burns. The police quickly got involved. When aggression becomes a pattern, it's like a signature. Detectives sat down with Jacob, Susan's biological son, in a room with toys meant to make scary conversations easier. The little boy's words came out between tears. Mommy hit Tommy. A lot. For nothing. The damage she caused the little boy was complete and irreversible. Tommy Whited would never speak again, never walk, never do anything but exist in the prison of his own severely impaired body. Susan was charged with felony assault and child abuse, words that felt too small for what she'd done. But here's the thing about justice. Sometimes it's less like a sword and more like a wet noodle. The prosecutors told people that proving abuse was hard without witnesses, as if Tommy's severely injured body wasn't witness enough. Susan pleaded guilty to 1 count of injury to a child, 5-year suspended sentence, no jail time. A suspended sentence is society's way of saying, we know you did something terrible, but we're going to pretend you'll never do it again. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a severed limb and calling it medicine. Lester took Tommy home, pouring his money into care for a grandson who would never know him again. Gary Campbell got Jacob back. And Tom? He kept sleeping with Susan even after she caused irreversible harm to his son. Trauma bonds are like superglue. The worse things get, the harder they stick. When someone has torn your life apart, sometimes you convince yourself they're the only one who can put it back together. But the suspended sentence hadn't taught Susan to stop. It had taught her she could get away with it. In 1984, Susan came crawling back to Peru, Indiana, 3 months pregnant with Tom Whitehead's baby. She'd burned through Oklahoma like a wildfire, leaving Tommy permanently disabled and her life in ashes. But Susan never looked back. Looking back meant facing what you'd done. Peru called itself Circus City, the last remnant of traveling carnivals that had once passed through. Susan wasn't the scared teenager who'd fled this place anymore. She'd learned things out in the world, how to wear different faces, how to make men see what they want to see, how to turn pregnancy into power. Even with a baby growing inside her, she walked into Peru's bars like she owned them, that old confidence burning brighter than ever. Some cops thought it would be funny to set pregnant Susan up with their buddy Jimmy Grund. A prank, really. Jimmy Grund's name meant something in Peru. His father had been a judge, his grandfather a prosecutor. The Grunds were legal royalty in a town that didn't have much royalty of any kind. Jimmy himself had followed the family recipe, law school at Indiana University, then straight back to Peru to join the prosecutor's office. He had that easy confidence that comes from never having to introduce yourself because everyone already knows who you are. But his marriage to his college sweetheart Jane had died in 1980, though they still lived in the same house for the kids, that classic lie parents tell when they're too scared to fully separate. At 39, Jimmy was softening around the edges. When 25-year-old Susan walked into that blind date, she didn't just meet him. She detonated in his life. Here was this young, magnetic woman who looked at him like he was still the golden boy, not the middle-aged man with thinning hair and thickening waist. For Jimmy, Susan was proof he still had it. For Susan, Jimmy was a ladder to climb, each rung made of money, respectability, and connections. December 6, 1984. Susan stood on Flagler Beach in Florida, the ocean behind her like a movie backdrop, marrying her fourth husband while 6 months pregnant with her third husband's baby. If life was a circus, Susan was the main act, juggling identities, relationships, and lies without dropping a single one. She'd told Jimmy the baby was his. One more lie when you've told so many is nothing. It's like adding a drop of water to the ocean. Jimmy believed her because believing her was easier than not believing her. But Susan had bigger goals than just marriage. She wanted Jacob back. With Jimmy's name and connections, she could rewrite history. She just had to rewrite it for Jimmy first. Susan told Jimmy about her conviction like she was confessing a parking ticket. She painted herself as a victim, a poor mother wrongly accused when her clumsy stepson had accidents. She cried in all the right places, made her voice shake with practiced grief. Here's the thing about prosecutors. They're trained to spot lies. But love makes idiots of us all. Jimmy, who'd sent dozens of abusers to prison, somehow couldn't see the one sharing his bed. He never called Oklahoma, never checked her story, never wondered why a woman would have to flee a state if she was innocent. Instead, he used his power like a magic wand, waving away obstacles. He sent checks to Gary Campbell, got him a job near Peru, and suddenly Jacob was back with Susan. He convinced Tom Whitehead to sign over custody of baby Tanel. One by one, Susan collected her children like she was gathering pieces for a game only she knew the rules to. By 1986, Susan had won. She lived in a $175,000 custom house, might as well have been a castle in Peru terms. Jimmy bought her a downtown boutique called Clothes by Susan, where she could play dress-up with other people's money. But winning was never enough. She entered the Mrs. Indiana America pageant at 31, still needing those eyes on her, that confirmation that she was special. She hung a nude painting of herself in their bedroom, not hidden, but displayed like a trophy, making sure every visitor knew exactly what kind of woman Jimmy had caught. Jimmy, meanwhile, was drowning in gin and tonics, each drink pulling him further from the surface. The accountant who did their taxes, the cop who patrolled their neighborhood, the preacher. Even, and this is where the whispers got loudest, Jimmy's own son, David. Small towns are like snow globes. Shake them once and everything swirls around, but it all settles back in the same place eventually. Everybody knew about Susan's adventures. The gossip moved through Peru like a current through veins, keeping the town alive with scandal. Jimmy's mother finally confronted him in 1990. "Your wife," she said, "is making you a fool." Jimmy shrugged. The shrug of a man who decided being a fool was better than being alone. But by 1991, the foundation was cracking. Someone reached out to authorities about Susan's behavior, and what they uncovered made their stomachs turn. The past she thought she'd buried came roaring back to life. Her severe abuse of Tommy Whited, those injuries that nearly caused the death of the child. For a woman whose entire identity was built on lies, an investigation is a special kind of torture. Every question threatens to expose another piece of the false life she'd constructed. Susan had always been in control. She decided what people knew, what they believed. Now, strangers were digging through her past, and she couldn't stop them. As the investigation deepened, Susan found herself cornered. The charming woman who'd climbed to the top of Peru society was losing her grip. The lies she'd spun for so many years were beginning to unravel like a sweater pulled at the thread. By summer 1992, Jimmy had reached his breaking point. The facade of his glamorous marriage had long since cracked, and now it was crumbling into dust. He confided in friends, his voice heavy with bitterness as he complained about the never-ending strain. But it wasn't just Susan's infidelities, it was her insatiable greed. The jewelry, the designer clothes, the luxury cars. Susan's spending was endless, like a hole that could never be filled, and it was draining him dry. When you realize someone married you for your money and status rather than love, it creates a unique kind of pain. It's not just heartbreak, it's humiliation. You weren't building a life together, you were being used. In mid-July, Jimmy consulted with a fellow lawyer to initiate divorce proceedings. He decided to hold off until after the family returned from their long-planned vacation to Alaska. As soon as they were back, he would file for divorce. But Jimmy would never get the chance to follow through. On Saturday, August 1st, the Grunds returned home from Alaska. 2 days later, on the stroke of midnight, Jimmy's life was taken with a single discharge of a firearm to the head. The act was so sudden and forceful that it left Peru reeling. The investigation would quickly turn its eyes to Susan, the grieving widow. Peru was acutely aware of the state of their marriage. By the time of the incident, half the town knew the marriage was in tatters. The other half, the joke went, had likely been intimate with Susan at one point or another. But when someone is about to lose everything, money, status, control, their brain can start doing dark calculations. Most people have that fleeting thought, what if this person just wasn't here? And immediately feel horrified. But for someone like Susan, who'd spent years treating people as objects to be used and discarded, that thought might start to seem like a solution. It began on July 4th, just a month before the incident. Susan visited her stepson David Grund at his home. While there, she casually asked where he kept his 9mm firearm. The question seemed innocent enough. Later that evening, when David returned from a fireworks show, he found his house had been broken into. Strangely, the only item missing was the firearm. At the time, it seemed like an unfortunate coincidence. But when the investigation began, it became chillingly clear that the firearm had disappeared for a reason. Think about what Susan did. She asked her stepson where his firearm was, then stole it to take his father's life. That requires a level of coldness that's hard to imagine. She looked David in the eye, talked to him like family, then used his trust to plan his father's death. There's a detachment there, an inability to see other people as real, feeling human beings, that's genuinely chilling. When investigators recovered a 9mm shell casing beside Jimmy's body, the connection became undeniable. Police recovered shell casings and slugs from a telephone pole that David had used for target practice. When they compared the slug to the one that caused Jimmy's death, the match was unmistakable. David's stolen firearm had been used to cause the death of his father. Shortly after the funeral, Susan moved quickly to collect a $250,000 life insurance policy and began working to declare herself executrix of Jimmy's estate. There's something particularly disturbing about someone who can attend their victim's funeral and immediately start thinking about money. It shows that the person whose life they took wasn't real to them. They were just an obstacle that needed to be removed. But Jimmy's children, David and Jama, immediately filed a lawsuit to block her. They found an ally in Sergeant Gary Nichols, Jimmy's best friend, who vowed to do everything he could to make sure Susan never saw a cent. While Susan schemed to gain control of the estate, she was dealing with a deadly secret. The weapon that caused the death was still inside the Grund house, hidden away. Paranoia crept in like fog. Every sound became suspicious. Every knock on the door might be the police. On September 2nd, desperate and feeling cornered, Susan confessed her actions to her sister Darlene Worden and her mother, Nellie Sanders. "I took Jimmy's life," she said, her voice cold and detached. That coldness is important. When people confess to terrible acts, their tone tells you a lot. Susan's voice was cold, like she was discussing a problem she needed help solving, not a human life she'd ended. Susan told them that the weapon was hidden inside a Christmas teddy bear tucked away in the laundry closet. Darlene agreed to retrieve the bear. The two women, along with their mother, began the process of disposing of the evidence. They placed the firearm at the bottom of a metal pot, then poured 70 pounds of wet cement on top, effectively encasing the weapon. The pot was then stored at the home of Susan's nephew. But the secret was far from safe. Covering up the taking of a life isn't like keeping a small secret. It's heavy. It grows. It follows you everywhere. Months passed, and the weight began to wear on Darlene. On November 2nd, she had a fateful encounter with Bob Brinson, the lead investigator on the case. Stricken by guilt, Darlene felt an overwhelming urge to come clean. Guilt is a funny thing. Some people can push it down, but for others, it becomes unbearable. It whispers when you're trying to sleep. It sits with you at breakfast. It makes you feel like you're drowning. Darlene had reached her breaking point. Within 36 hours of their conversation, Susan Grund was arrested for causing the death of her husband. Nellie Sanders, Susan's own mother, had been carrying a weight that was crushing her from the inside out. When you help your child hide evidence related to the taking of a life, every night becomes a conversation with your own soul, and Nellie's soul was screaming. She finally broke, told the police about the concrete pot hidden in her attic, tucked under boxes of old clothes and Christmas decorations. When Sergeant Nichols climbed those attic stairs, he found exactly what Nellie promised: Susan's attempt to bury the truth in concrete. Here's what happens when mothers protect their dangerous children. They become accomplices to nightmares. Nellie had spent her whole life watching Susan destroy things, marriages, children, now a man's life, and still tried to shield her. But even a mother's love has limits. When those limits break, the truth pours out like water through a dam. With the firearm in hand, prosecutor Will Siders had everything: the weapon, the motive of money, and a trail of lies longer than a highway. Susan was charged with causing death, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. September 1993. The Peru courthouse had never seen anything like it. Susan Grund's trial for causing the death of her husband was the kind of show that made people call in sick to work just to grab a courtroom seat. Every secret, every lie, every dark corner of the Grund family was about to be dragged into daylight. Susan took the stand with a story so shocking it sucked the air from the room. Yes, she'd hidden the firearm, but only because she recognized it as David's weapon. She'd stuffed it in a teddy bear to protect her stepson. Then came the bomb. We had an affair. She sobbed through her confession, claiming she and David had been sleeping together for 2 years, that he'd once whispered in the dark that he was going to get rid of his dad. She threw this accusation like a grenade, hoping the explosion would distract from her own guilt. David Grund sat in the front row, still as a statue, while Susan painted him as both her lover and the person who caused his father's death. When your stepmother accuses you of the two worst things imaginable, you don't flinch. You let your stillness speak louder than her lies. When David took the stand, his words were sharp and clear. I never had an affair with that woman. The way he said that woman, like she was something he'd scrape off his shoe, told the jury everything. But the real devastating moment came when Susan's own blood turned against her. Darlene Worden took the stand shaking with rage that had been building for decades. When family members testify against each other, it's like watching a house burn from the inside out. Darlene didn't just call Susan a liar. She said she'd always been a liar, the kind of statement that rewinds through every family memory, marking them all as false. "Why'd you do it?" Darlene screamed across the courtroom. And in that question was a lifetime of watching her sister choose destruction over and over again. Despite everything, the evidence, the family testimony, the obvious lies, two jurors couldn't let go of Susan's affair story. Maybe they thought no woman would make up something that horrible. Maybe they just couldn't believe evil could wear such a pretty face. 15 hours of deliberation ended in a hung jury. Susan's ability to plant doubt was like a superpower she'd perfected over decades of manipulation. March 1994. Round 2. Prosecutor Will Siders had learned his lesson. Never underestimate a pathological liar's ability to muddy water until nobody can see the bottom. This time, he brought 5 new witnesses, pillars of Indiana society who'd encountered Susan during her marriage to Jimmy. One by one, they testified to the same truth. Susan Grund would lie about what she had for breakfast if she thought it would get her something. When multiple, unconnected people all say you're a liar, it's not a conspiracy, it's a pattern. These weren't angry family members or bitter exes. They were neutral observers who'd watched Susan operate and recognized her for what she was. Charlie Scruggs, Susan's lawyer, knew the affair accusation had almost saved her once, but wouldn't work twice. Lightning doesn't strike the same lie twice. He told Susan to keep that story in her pocket this time. Without her nuclear option, Susan had to face the evidence naked, no shocking distractions to hide behind. March 23rd, 1994. Guilty. The word fell like an axe. 3 weeks later, Judge John Surbeck sentenced her to 60 years for causing the death of Jimmy, calmly, coldly, and calculatingly. 3 words that captured exactly how someone discharges a firearm at their spouse while he works on his legal papers, comfortable in what he thinks is safety. Jacob and Tanel, Susan's children, went to live with Jimmy's sister Jane and her husband Fred. Finally, these kids who'd been chess pieces in their mother's games had a chance at normal. They could have bedtimes without fear, birthdays without manipulation, love without conditions. By 2007, Susan had been in Indiana women's prison for 15 years, but her mind hadn't spent a single day there. People who can't admit guilt live in a parallel universe where they're always the victim, always the hero of their own false story. She filed appeal after appeal, each one insisting on her innocence, like a broken record playing the same wrong note. The year 2025 would bring Susan's first chance at parole, her 67th birthday present from the state of Indiana. But David Grund had been preparing for this moment like a soldier preparing for war. He'd gone to law school, graduated in 1997, joined his grandfather's practice. Every case he won, every year he practiced, he was building himself into the weapon that would keep Susan in prison. David had transformed his trauma into purpose. Some people let false accusations destroy them. David let them forge him into something harder, sharper. He'd become the guardian of his father's memory and the wall between Susan and freedom. As 2025 approached, Susan kept fighting from her cell, suing the prison for medical care, filing legal challenges, never once saying the words, "I did it." Admitting guilt would mean admitting she'd been Susan all along, not the victim she'd played for so long she'd forgotten it was a performance. The woman who'd had everything, beauty, wealth, a respected name, and threw it all away for the brief satisfaction of discharging the firearm, now faced her final audience. Not a jury of strangers, but the stepson she tried to destroy with lies, now armed with law degrees and determination. David Grund stood ready to speak at every parole hearing, to remind the board of who Susan really was beneath all her masks. He'd become what she never expected, not just a survivor of her lies, but her permanent consequence. Susan's story, which started with a girl trying to escape poverty and abuse, had come full circle. She'd climbed so high, stepping on everyone who loved her, only to end up in a concrete cell not much bigger than the trailer she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The woman who'd renamed herself to become someone new had become exactly what she'd always been, a prisoner, just with different walls. As the clock ticked toward her parole date, Susan Grund faced the one thing she'd never been able to manipulate, seduce, or lie away: time itself. And standing between her and freedom was David Grund, the boy she'd tried to break, Now the man who would make sure she paid for every second of the life she'd taken from his father. The circus had finally ended. The performer had taken her final bow. And the audience, David, the state of Indiana, and the memory of Jimmy Grund, would decide if she ever got to leave the stage.
Thank you for watching and staying till the end. Every story we tell is a piece of someone's truth, and your support helps keep their voice alive. If you felt something today, don't just move on. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so together we can keep shining light into the darkest corners of the human mind.